everyone, and welcome to today's Elemental webinar, where we'll be discussing approaches to developing and financing solar PV projects for the public sector. While local authorities are generally aware of the many benefits of solar, finding room in the budget for it and indeed accessing relevant finance opportunities is often a prohibitive obstacle. So this session is going to look at development and funding options for the public sector organisations looking to generate and store solar energy, and also how investment can tackle rising fuel bills. So we've got a great panel here today, including Laura Couldrey, who's the Programme Manager for Local Authorities at Salix Finance, and Robert Schrimpff, co-founder and CEO of Solar for Schools. So hello both and welcome. We've got a few talking points lined up, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. So audience, feel free to pop a question in the chat or in the ask a question box below, and we will try to get to as many as we can, but we do just have the hour set aside today. So we'll kick things off by looking at some common obstacles in getting solar projects off the ground. Laura, in the work you do with local authorities, what are some of the most common challenges do you find in this area?
Hi, thank you. Obviously, there are lots of conflicting priorities at the moment for local authorities. And in our day-to-day work, we mostly see, obviously, number one would be the money and funding available to deliver these projects because they are big investments. But apart from that, we also have like internal resource. People at the local authorities might not have the necessary resources available to know where to start and get going with these, and how they can really deliver a great business case to get buy-in from their leaders, which is another one I think is having this conflicting resources and priorities, getting buy-in from the leaders to set aside time and investment for these projects can be quite a lot of work for internal people working on this. And then also, I think kind of long-term policy and kind of areas where in the long term, they know that there's going to be their investment there, or long-term targets, so that it's they can plan effectively for those. As obviously a lot of these things take time to get the buy-in to deliver these business cases, to deliver these projects. Having that long-term targets there gives them more time to do it as well. So, and when things can keep changing, or funding places keep changing, or leaders keep changing their priorities, it doesn't give enough long-term time for these projects to be developed.
Okay, great. Thank you, Laura. Robert, you've got a raft of experience in solar development and investment. What are your thoughts here? I mean, how can these typical challenges be overcome?
Yeah, I think I was thinking about what the challenges were, and I agree with Laura. The internal capacity and the internal processes in councils is a significant challenge. And I think there's also a bit of a chicken and egg situation where you don't know on day one what are the different options out there might work for you. Investigating those options obviously requires time and effort, which you don't necessarily have, and therefore you never do that. And then to the second point is, okay, so you want to do solar panels, but how big a project? What's the most sensible project? So you've got a bit of a chicken and egg situation, that you need to spend some time on it before you know what's possible, but you don't want to spend any time on it until you know if it's viable. And so how do you reduce that chicken and egg situation? And so we've put a lot of effort into developing an online portal tool where we've uploaded, in our case, every school in the UK. And you can very quickly look up your school, or a council can look up all the schools in their council, and it ranks them by potential. So you can very quickly filter out what the total potential for those schools would be, and what the sort of low-hanging fruit would be. And then quite quickly, with a little bit of our help or with a little bit of training, they can then dive into each school and with literally minutes work out whether it would make economic sense or not in today's market environment. The good news is that given current electricity prices, apart from very small primaries, solar is currently pretty attractive on pretty much any school.
Great. Okay, thank you, Robert. So actually that sort of helps to answer the next question then, which is it's looking at making the business case for solar. Laura, how can local authorities go about making the business case for this technology? And how does a finance company such as Salix work with them to achieve their funding objectives?
Yeah, I mean, what Robert said there about it being an easy win, out of all the energy efficiency works or additional renewable energy projects that schools or local authorities and their buildings they can do, solar is a relatively easy win. The prices for solar has gone down dramatically in the past decade, and as he says, energy prices are just going up and up and up. But also, they're really integral to the long-term delivery of being net zero. Public sectors have to be net zero by 2050 at the latest, but the majority of these local authorities have brought that a lot more further and closer to the future. So, or declared climate emergencies. So to really bring that business case back, take a step back, look at what your actual local authority have already pledged. That's a great business case to start with the solar work, because we need to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, and obviously solar having on your roof already there is an easy win. So it is relatively easy, especially when you look at other bigger investments. Obviously, Rob said, you can do one, or you can do a much larger projects across maybe even a solar farm. But obviously those are different in terms of scale and prices. But starting small and then expanding and looking at the potential that they can bring can really support that business case. I'd also say looking not just at solar and how the solar can then help you do the next steps in decarbonising your heat, removing fossil fuel heating and those associated emissions. They can really then build a business case for other projects, such as air source or ground source heat pumps, which can remove your boilers and use of your fossil fuels, because obviously they depend on electricity. So if you've got your solar already in place, or you're thinking about those, solar can really help bring the price or the costs down, because you're not buying more energy from the grid. But yeah, I think taking a step back, looking at the whole process and seeing that. So yeah, at Salix, that's what we are doing at the moment. We are delivering these grant schemes or loan schemes, but we don't just focus on one energy technology, just solar. It's a holistic approach. You want to look at your whole building and see what is the most value for money projects that you can do. But as I said, solar is integral to some of these other projects. But then also looking at your energy efficiency of your buildings. There's no point investing in thousands of solar panels if your energy or heating is going straight out the window. It's just a waste of your money. You've got to look at the whole building and see where the biggest investments would be and your biggest paybacks would be. So any buildings that are really got high energy bills, look at the energy efficiency, and then once you've done that, you can put in your solar, and you know that your solar energy that's being generated isn't going straight out the window, because that's another bit to put in your business case. Like, why would they put finance into something which in the long term isn't going to be that beneficial? And then look at other stakeholders in your area. Obviously, there are schools, which might be more individual basis, but if they're part of academy trusts, work together with the trusts and your local stakeholders or other areas that can work together. If you're doing larger schemes that can really bring benefits to the wider community. Obviously, in schools or leisure centres, it's a great piece of just having your solar on the roof. It gives a great sign that your local authority is doing something really good and is delivering on your pledges as well. So bringing together the whole community can also really help your business case.
Okay, thank you, Laura. And from what Laura's mentioned here, Robert, it seems like a lot of it is around having data and having information, and this must play a very critical role here. So how important is it that local authorities are armed with the right data and info before looking at development opportunities? And you've already mentioned the portal, which will give public sector officials the opportunity to identify straight off the bat whether something's going to be feasible or not. So I'm assuming data is going to play a very significant role.
Yeah, I mean, you can't make a significant financial investment, regardless of whether it's your money or someone else's money, without some data and figures to back it. Solar is relatively straightforward. You can forecast the energy generation of any location or roof. There are databases to do that. That's actually built into our website now too. The key piece of information we need in terms of making a decision around solar for a school is how much electricity they're currently consuming and how much they're paying. So we only need 2 pieces of data to be able to come up with a first pass, and a visual sight of the roof, which we can do over Google Maps and a conversation with someone who knows the school. So we've limited or reduced the amount of effort required to get the data we need. But you'd be amazed, we get about 4 registrations a day, and the first question we ask is, could you please send us your electricity bills? And only half of them come back even with that data. Yeah. So one thing the councils could do is make it a lot easier for schools to actually know how much they're consuming on electricity. And now, again, solar is relatively easy, and getting electricity bills should be relatively straightforward. Heating is much more complex. And Laura's right. I mean, one shouldn't just do solar and go, tick, done, we're home and dry. Solar will actually only reduce a relatively small fraction of the total CO2 footprint of a school. We can, on a medium-sized school, generate as much electricity as the school would consume on average throughout the year. But given that the school's generating most of the electricity in the summer when the school's often closed, and consumes most of it in the winter when the sun doesn't shine much, we can only probably use about 50% of the electricity from the solar panels within that school. So if you take, even if you assume you could generate as much as the school needs on average, and therefore you've decarbonized the electricity consumption completely, the biggest CO2 footprint in a school is its heating. And the only real steps there is you need to move your heating over to heat pumps. And if you move over to heat pumps, you need even more electricity, and you need even more solar. And unfortunately, heat pumps need that electricity in the winter, just when solar panels don't really generate much. So you end up having to try and effectively put as much solar as you possibly can on your building, because once you then electrify your heating bill, you're not going to be able to cover your total consumption. So one of the mistakes that schools, that councils often do, is they put the smallest amount of solar panels on the roof they can get away with for planning consent, or what they can currently afford what's in their budget, rather than really trying to finance or fund as much solar as they possibly can on that roof, especially if they're going to do heat pumps, or even possibly combine it. So Salix won't fund solar on its own, but they will fund or contribute towards solar if it's part of a heat grant. So yes, data for solar is important, and doing it holistically is useful. Thinking about you're going to move your heating over to electricity at some point means that you could probably want to put more solar rather than less. But equally, I wouldn't let lack of data paralyze, because there are certain things that any building can do without vast amounts of data beforehand, and that's, if you haven't replaced your lighting with LED, that's kind of a no-brainer. Just get on and do it, and that will reduce your electricity consumption. So if you're trying to optimize your solar PV, it's worth having done LED first. Insulation and converting to heat pumps kind of go hand in hand, because putting a heat pump in a very inefficient building, as Laura pointed out, doesn't make a huge amount of sense. Unfortunately, some buildings are just very, very, very hard to insulate properly, and so they may need to take a longer-term view as to what you do with that building at all. Now, our view with the solar panels and the solar panels we fund is that we expect some of those projects, those schools, not to be around during the 25-year period, and we factor that into our financial model. We expect about half the schools that we fund to replace or need to re-roof, so we'll take the solar panels down and put them on, and a fraction of the schools will shut down and we'll have to put the solar panels somewhere else. So don't let the long-term plan get in the way of at least a few low-hanging fruit. So LED, as long as you're going to be using the building for at least 2 or 3 years, go out and do it. And as long as you can see at least 10 years of use out of the building, put solar on it. Because the worst thing you can do is wait, and then 10 years from now still find out you've got another 10 years on your building and you missed out on 10 years of lower bills. So don't let lack of data or lack of vision of the future paralyze you. There are certain things that you can do now.
Okay, thank you, Robert. So let's talk about something that's going to be quite central in the minds of our audience, and that is money and financing. And we've already had a few questions come through about financing opportunities here. So Laura, could you briefly outline some of the key funding mechanisms that local authorities can explore when investigating solar projects?
Yeah, sure. I think just covering what Robert said initially, obviously he's got their tools there. There are also local consultancies or companies that could also have a look at for you. Like if you initially don't have any funding to start the process, they could just have a quick review and let you know what your options are, perhaps for free. We've seen that before in local authorities we've worked with. But actual schemes, so at Salix, we do offer Salix funding for heat decarbonisation projects, and we have current 2 schemes at the moment which accept applications on an annual basis, which is the Low Carbon Skills Fund, which is designed to develop heat decarbonisation plans for the public sector in England. So you can apply for funding for a plan to review your estates, looking at your buildings, and put together these plans on how you can reduce your carbon emissions for the estates. So things such as feasibility studies can be done, designs, investment grade proposals, surveys, or even desktop analysis. So you can apply for funding for these pieces of work to then help you pay for a review of those and putting plans together. And then this links in with our public sector decarbonisation scheme, which we're now in the phase 3 of. Recently, we had phase 3B open for applications, which is for the capital funding available for these projects. As I said, we can't do solar on their own, but that's in part of further mostly it's electrification of heating projects, but we also see biomass and other areas of heating to reduce fossil fuel dependency. Now, there's a lot of criteria in that, which I won't go into, but it's all there on our Salix website. So if you just Google Salix Finance, you'll be able to find all that information. We have phase 3B, which is just closed for applications, but we're hoping for 3C in a year's time. So if you've already done a skills fund project, for example, or you've got a plan together, you've identified your potential projects that you want to do next year, have a look and keep an eye out on our website for that. The criteria can change a little bit, but that will be all shared prior. Scotland and Wales, they have different schemes available depending on what type of your project is. I'm not sure if anyone here is from Scotland and Wales, but just want to make that clear. In terms of other funding available, for schools, there is the Condition Improvement Fund, which I believe does provide some funding for solar in addition to estates and investing in their estates. But that's delivered by the Department of Education. And then other schemes available, I've seen on Community Energy England, they provide a list of some local government funding. And then other areas in terms of actual grants or loans, I haven't been able to find much, but there are significant schemes and institutions available to help with these. So Local Government Association, they've got a huge climate hub there with knowledge and resources and tools. The Net Zero Energy Hubs, they work with the local enterprise partnerships. Refit is quite big in the south as well. And they work together to support that low carbon transition. And they can also look at your projects for you and work together with different local authorities. And then there's also energy saving trusts or the carbon trust that also do this type of work as well.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Robert, are there any funding pitfalls or danger hotspots that local authorities should be mindful of when going down this avenue?
I'm not entirely sure that I'm the best person to answer that question because I only sort of see it from one side. I have come across schools who funded solar in the past using forms of operating lease where if the system stops working, it's on the school's onus to cover the cost of repairing it. So there are certain liabilities with some of those early agreements. I haven't seen those in the last 5 or 6 years. I think they're no longer possible. One other sort of challenge I guess we have is that we often work with schools and councils where we do a combination of funded through our community benefit society that we use to fund the projects that we provide the funding for, but often combine that with grants. So the public sector decarbonisation scheme has been providing funding for heat pumps, for example, in Leeds, which we work with quite closely. So we've been doing the solar part of those projects, and part of that grant has gone towards funding that solar. It has made the overall projects more complex and puts a greater sort of burden on us compared to if we just funded it entirely through the CBS, which is much more easy. We certainly encourage people to find other grants or sources of funding to combine with funding we provide, because although the community benefit societies are not for profit, and therefore any surplus from those projects goes back to the schools, if they can find money from parents or the PTA or a local grant, that then brings down the solar price even further and increases their savings. So I think it is possible to fund solar on, as I said, other than small shady primaries, at a point where you can save money today. In the past, that wasn't the case, and you definitely needed other grants and other sources of funding to make it work. If you can easily get some free money or some local grants, then by all means do. But there's sometimes a bit of a lottery. And then we've also seen schools who delay a project by a couple of years because they're trying to find a grant. They get the grant, but actually if they worked out the savings that are made for the 2 years they lost out on, it would have been greater than the grant in the first place. So I think there's a case of you could try and over-optimize to shave another £1,000 off your project by getting another grant, but if it delays it by another year and it takes your time, don't over-optimize on that. I think speed at the moment is probably more important. If it ticks the boxes and shows some savings, just hurry up and get on with it.
Thank you, Robert. Okay. So you mentioned earlier different ways to maximize the technologies that are being installed. So we have touched on this already, but I am keen to cover the idea of how to get the very most out of projects here. And that if local authorities are going to make investments into solar, what they can do to make sure they're really pushing the benefits of it. So I know we've already discussed this, but are there any other considerations around the tech itself or how it's installed or add-on technologies that could really boost efficiencies so they are getting their money's worth?
Yeah, so one of the concerns, or one of the reasons in the past that schools or councils delayed doing solar was they went, well, solar's getting cheaper and getting better. I'll just wait a few more years and then the panels will be twice as good, half the price. And that, if you come from a sort of IT background, that seems to have been the rule. In the solar space, yes, module prices have been coming down until about a year ago. They've now gone up 50% in the last 12 months. So we're now paying over £300 a kilowatt, and we were paying just over 200 a year ago. So they don't always go down. And technology is getting better, but it's getting better at a 0.5% or 0.5% a year. So waiting 5 years is going to make 2.5% difference. So again, waiting for the next sort of technology hurdle in solar is not worth waiting for. Just get on with it. Then that's on the solar piece. Where technology has improved a little bit more is on inverters. The inverters are a bit more reliable, lighter, bigger, cheaper. That has improved. Unfortunately, it means that probably most of them are now coming from China, like most of the solar equipment. So it'd be really, really nice to see Europe getting together and promoting the manufacture of equipment in Europe. And that would also get around some of the sort of moral issues around forced labor in China. So I think more than a technology evolution, there's a sort of a bit of a moral and social shift. So as a council, you might want to take a view that you're prepared to pay 10 or 20% premium for European-made equipment rather than Asian-made equipment. But that's quite a tough sell internally. But that's one that you could consider. So that's one angle to consider. The other area is batteries, and that's often the question: are we going to put batteries in our schools? The issue, again, is that a school consumes most electricity during the day, not much during the night and weekends. So the life cycle use of the battery is not great compared to a residential situation. And so typically when you model it, you find that the battery sits empty all winter and fills up at the beginning of summer and stays full pretty much all summer. So not a very good use of the battery. Now, that is beginning to change for a number of reasons. One, batteries are becoming cheaper. And at some point, the electricity we sell back to the grid, and I'm touching on one of the questions, is we typically sell back to the grid between 25 and 50% of the electricity generated by a system. In the past, it was about 3.5p, and we're selling it to the school at, say, 15p, so you're making, say, 12p, and the 12p didn't go backwards and forwards enough inside the battery enough times, or didn't charge and discharge the battery enough times for it to really make any sense. With electricity prices at sort of 25 or 30p, and potentially in 3 or 4 years' time, the grid no longer paying very much for what you export back from your solar panels, because there'll be so many solar panels exporting on a Saturday afternoon, then at that point, a battery might make sense again. But at the moment, we've seen very few cases where batteries as a standalone case, i.e. not trying to manage the grid, make economic sense. So that's kind of one that people get excited about, but at the moment, we haven't seen a sensible application for. So at the moment, I think the thing in terms of technology, is have an internal view as to how happy you are to be using Asian equipment or pay a premium for not doing so. And then typically go for the largest possible system you can afford or finance, because you're going to use that energy at some point in the future when you decarbonize the rest of your building with heating. And in terms of add-on efficiency technologies, I think they then go another level of granularity down in terms of what technologies you use. But I think that's beyond the scope of this conversation. I think the short of it is the technology is not moving very fast. Waiting doesn't bring an advantage. Bolting on a battery at the moment doesn't make much sense. But going for as large as you possibly can to get the biggest economy of scale and therefore the lowest cost per unit does probably make sense. That wasn't what we recommended 2 or 3 years ago, but at the moment that's our recommendation.
Thank you, Robert. Laura, would you agree? I mean, in terms of the kinds of projects you've seen, in terms of size and scale that are typically implemented by local authorities, would that make sense to you?
Yeah, it's always the largest that you can do, but obviously there are restrictions on that. That makes the most sense. We see like typical the own schools, it's harder to bring that payback because of they're only in the winter, when the sun's not shining, we're not seeing the benefits of it as much, because that's when the building's being used, but in the evenings it's not, or in the summer it's empty. So the paybacks aren't so good, and with the price being sold back to the grid is pittance, really. So it's not seen as such a key benefit of it being installed, but it is the initial investment will bring further investment in the future. As Robert says, as you decarbonize your building over the next 10 years or so, it's a major important investment to start delivering on these and installing them. And if you are part of a local authority, doing them all together at once is always, you're going to see better payback and better use of your funding of the money, because of the additional savings, and how different buildings are used really impacts that. But looking at as I said, going back to that data and making sure you have all these energy meters, you know your data, you know where you're consuming the most and what time of day you're using it the most, is really important to then be able to build on that and identify the next steps and where to invest. Part of our scheme is that you have to meet a compliancy for carbon cost threshold. So you can only spend so much money on saving a ton of carbon. And so those ones, again, as I mentioned, the smaller ones where the energy consumption isn't that high already, it's harder to meet that compliancy. So yeah, doing it all together as much as you can is definitely the best foot forward.
Great, thank you, Laura. Okay, so these are the questions that we've had on our agenda. We're now going to open the floor up to the audience. So audience, if you do have any questions, please keep them coming. We've got quite a few to be getting on with first here. So what I'll do, I'll just share these questions, and then Robert, Laura, please just jump in with whatever insight you might have. So have one question here. Can heat networks be part of the public sector funding scheme mentioned by Laura?
Yeah, so connecting your building to a heat network is eligible. It's one of our low carbon heating sources as part of the scheme. So that was eligible for our previous rounds of funding. But I couldn't say for definite if that would be the case for next year or for the next phase of the scheme, because we're always trying to review the scheme and try and get most value for money out of it to get the most carbon savings out of the grant funding that we have. But I think, yeah, heat networks are a really important technology especially for multiple areas and large estates. So we hope that will continue being eligible.
Okay, great. Question from Sarah. When does the next PSDS funding round open?
Yeah, as I said, we're hopefully next year sometime, but I couldn't give you an answer on that. Yeah, I'm afraid.
Okay, fine, no worries. Here we have, do you find procurement is an issue?
Do you want to answer that, or should I? I guess it affects probably more us than Salix. Yes, procurement is a massive issue. And I think I might take the opportunity of answering at the same time another question, because the way we fund the solar projects is through basically a power purchase agreement, whereby the school agrees to paying a certain amount per unit of electricity that they consume from the solar panels. They only pay for what they consume, and they pay a price that is indexed to RPI, so that goes up at a predictable, or relatively predictable way over time. And given that inflation has always lagged about 2% behind electricity price increases, the view is that you save more over time. So it's a power purchase agreement, but it's for 25 years. So this goes back to the procurement question, which is a council sometimes struggles with working out where that fits, because it's not a capital expenditure, which would have to go out to procurement, but it's a contract that over a 25-year period adds up to a reasonable amount of money, especially if you're going for quite a large system on a secondary school. So at what point do you have to tender? And then how do you tender? Because it's very difficult to compare like with like. In our case, the main reason Solar for Schools does solar panels in the first place is that we want to use the solar panels and the income stream that they generate to provide carbon literacy education to the students within them. So as part of managing their solar panels, we do workshops at the schools when we visit them every year, and we provide a whole lot of online materials to do it. So that adds another dimension to our offer. How is that compared? Is that unique enough so that they can then do a direct award? Some councils believe that's the case and do so, or is it not? In which case they have to go out to tender, and then they struggle with the problem of how do you find 3 people who provide something even vaguely similar? So yes, procurement is an issue.
Laura, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, we can't, as a government body, we don't we don't really part of that procurement process with our clients who are using our grant funding. It's up to them to follow their own procurement rules, really. Obviously, there are other areas which we can try and, support the delivery, but it's not something that we can really kind of play into. But yeah, it's the time that it takes is obviously a significant factor in our funding, because we have grant timescales that have to be delivered. So it's kind of just ensuring that the clients have their plans ready prior to reviewing the grant, because it will be something that's looked at application.
Okay. Question here from Liz. I work in community energy capacity building. Does Salix have any experience of working with partnership delivery between community energy projects and local authorities?
We had a couple of consortium bids for one of our schemes. So that is allowed as part of an application, if that's kind of what you're referring to, if you can. So the community partners can join up together to do an application for one of our schemes. Obviously, all of those partners have to be public sector, but it can be a school, leisure centres, local authorities, hospitals, or secondary schools, or universities or colleges as well. They can like partner up together, be a partnership, and apply for the funding as one. But obviously it would have to have very clear governance structures, making sure that all partners are on the same page and are delivering what's required to deliver the scheme and be applicable for the grant. But that is a possibility, and those projects are welcomed. And as I said before, we've said the bigger the better, so it does work out as better funding, but better value for money for you and delivering the carbon savings as well.
On that note, if I may add, we are very keen to work with community energy groups. We worked with 2 or 3 so far successfully, and probably half a dozen that we're still trying to get to that point. And one of the reasons we developed this online tool is so that community benefit groups or community energy groups can use that to accelerate the process. One of the things that community energy groups have, which is a huge advantage, is they have what we call sort of social capital. They know the people locally, they know the schools, they know the councils, and that's their biggest asset. What they don't have is experience in terms of putting a financial model together, raising the funds for a project, managing those projects, and that's the bit that we can bring. And so if we can provide them with our sort of centralized expertise and tools, and they then do the local contact piece, that works really, really, really well. Our biggest challenge is getting them to focus on the low-hanging fruit, which is solar, rather than going off and doing some hydro project, which might take the next decade. And I'm very happy for them to go to a hydro project, but we try and encourage them to sort of start with something relatively easy. It still takes 2 years to do a solar project on average. And then with the experience gained from doing that and working with the council and getting such a project funded and off the ground, then tackle something slightly more ambitious. I hope that answers your question, Liz.
So we have another question actually from Liz here, and this might be something you'll be able to refer to in terms of links in the chat. I'm looking for some stats about the potential carbon saving and gigawatt generation capacity from across the UK local authority estate. Are there any projections of these figures anywhere?
I don't know about the entire estate, but we've modelled the solar potential of the 27,000 schools or so, and it's about 2 gigawatts. That number is increasing gradually and has jumped up a little bit recently because of the fact that electricity prices have gone up, which means that we can sort of push the boundaries of what roofs we use. We don't have to just use the perfect roofs, we can use some of the other ones too. But it's about 2 gigawatts.
Okay, so a comment here for Laura from Karen Gray, who says, in terms of PSDS or Salix funding, the issue for us is the timeline for delivery is too short. There are massive costs from the DNO and slow responses from them, plus a lack of skilled companies able to deliver. We need greater support from Salix, and the timeline for delivery needs to be longer. Laura, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we are aware of these significant there are some restrictions on the grant funding. What I could say is that we have adapted to this feedback over the past 3 years. We have seen the most previous recent round, we had planning years and planning year included in our grant timelines options. So we had multi-year options, single year options, and then the planning year options as well. And so that has been an additional, in addition to the most recent round of funding. We are restricted by our financial budget system that the government and we all refer to in terms of the grant funding. So we can't just provide you with funding for an open-ended period of time. So it is restricted by that annual budget. But we are looking at ways at how we can adapt the system to still comply with those restrictions, but make better flexibility for the delivery of the project. So please, do look at our most recent 3B guidance on the planning year and the different years options that were available for applicants. So we're hoping to deliver on that, and then but continually adapt as the feedback is received.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Robert, would you like to see any changes in government policy to support solar installations?
I mean, we've spent the last 2 years talking to the DFE on a regular basis. And I think the DFE kind of needs to work out whether they want to be part of the solution or get out of the way and stop being the problem. And it's pretty harsh. But if I look at the process to develop a project over the last, we've been doing it for 7 years, and it's actually getting harder, a lot harder. We now have to go through DFE approval and Secretary of State approval. And both of them love what we do, but we still have to go through it. And the number of projects that drop because basically schools and councils just go, really? It's just, we're going to save, yes, 10 tons of CO2, and we're going to save £5,000 a year, which will grow over time. But, this is just so much work. So I think the government needs to kind of be clear as to whether either they get involved and help and make it happen, or they get out of the way and let other people do it. But at the moment, they're half house. Now, this is the DFE in particular. And don't get me wrong, I think there's a lot of people in the DFE who are brilliant and lovely, and they're trying to do a great job, but they're sort of tied up in knots internally. And I kind of laugh at that every council is declared a climate emergency. I haven't noticed the difference. It's still really, really tough. And I think until there are some teeth behind that legislation, not much is going to change. So I think the thing that really, really is needed, and I know it sounds terrible at a time where electricity prices are so high, is that as soon as electricity prices start to come down, as they will, that the government quickly steps in and slips in a carbon tax in that gap. They can't do it now. I mean, the EU couldn't implement a carbon tax today. It would bankrupt us all. But when it starts to alleviate, that's the perfect timing to then slide in a carbon tax. And if the governments of the EU, and I'm not talking the UK, Europe, don't slip in a carbon tax at that point, we're missing a huge and massive opportunity. And I think we will not just hit the 1.5, but we've already missed the 1.5 degree heating target. We'll miss the 2 degree heating target. Too many people involved, too many discussions that slow everything down.
Laura, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, there is, bureaucracy in these things. And I mean, I can't say politically what we should be doing, but making it easier and having that obvious benefit, maintain the momentum of installation of these PVs and other technologies is really important. We did used to work with the DFE on some schemes, but we no longer do. But I can look into that and see how we can try and improve that. Share the feedback from that. So if you do have any feedback, please feel free to get in contact with us and to see how we can help.
Okay. Question here about the tech itself. What about integrating EV charging with solar? Can this be an approach for public sector buildings, and are there advantages? This might be a question for Robert.
So during COVID, when the economics of solar were pretty tight, and schools surprisingly had more important things to deal with than putting some solar panels on their roof, we did look at other ways of making the whole proposition more economically attractive. And amongst those was batteries, didn't work, and charging points. And we thought, great, charging points would be fantastic, right? Huge big car parks, unused in the evenings. People can turn up and park their car and charge their vehicle. In practice, it's actually harder because of most school car parks are now fenced in for security reasons. So they'd have to then change the way they deal with their fencing to make it publicly accessible. There are cases where they have some parking outside the fence, and that would work, or just provide it for teachers and staff. And we have seen a growing number of EV charging points installed in schools. There are a growing number of companies who are providing that as a sort of third-party offering, i.e. they'll finance it. But the economics are pretty marginal still. It's getting better. You just need, it's one of those things, that piece of capital that's sitting there. The box itself doesn't cost that much. Managing the box is a little more expensive, and wiring it in back from your junction box to your car park, that could be the expensive piece. So there are cases where you could just drill through one wall and put a wall box on the wall, and you happen to be backing onto the car park, and then that's pretty cheap, and then it's pretty a no-brainer. You might be able to do it for about £1,000. But in other cases, it might cost £3,000 or £4,000 or even £10,000 because you have to sort of dig a trench for cable. So it's horses for courses. And if you then look at opportunities where it's low cost, it's not inside a fence, and therefore get enough people using it, it starts to limit it down quite dramatically. Now, again, over time, that will change. As more and more people have electric vehicles, you don't rely on general public charging there, but just teachers and those who are in school during the day, then the economics will start to get better.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Question here from James Galloway, who says, "Hi, I'm running an energy as a service trial for renewables. The feedback I've had from public sector customers so far has been very positive. There is, however, a large education piece to overcome any concerns, especially relating to bad past experiences with PFI. Are there any materials available that I can share with customers to promote funded decarbonisation in the public sector? I can see lots of excellent tools on the Salix website, but they are not downloadable."
Not downloadable. Is that, might have to check your login, so maybe email us about that. Mostly it is though catered for public sector clients rather than private, which is why it might not be available to you. The other areas that I did mention before might have some tools, the Community Energy England, local, and the Net Zero public sector hubs have a lot of information available for use. Sorry, what was the other part of the question?
Are there any materials available that I can share with customers to promote funded decarbonisation in the public sector?
There are sort of public sector networks, but again, I think you might have to be public sector to access it. So this might be a bit of an issue. But that's all I can think of at the moment.
Robert, do you have any insight on that?
Well, we're a very sort of narrow part of the public sector. We just do schools. But yes, you can register on our website, give your account. You can then go along and look at any particular school. And then you can download a report for that school that you can share with that school, or you download a report for an entire council and share it with that council.
Fantastic. Okay.
Have a play, if that helps you, have a play on our website. Actually, I'll add the website address to the chat if I can.
Okay.
Sorry, Laura, go on. Themselves, if you're on the newsletter or the installers section of the newsletter as well on your website, that there's always lots of information there. EDI as well is great. There is a lot out there. It's just finding it, isn't it?
Well, actually, that sort of, as you say, there's a lot out there. It's just finding it. And James's question does point to there is a large education piece to overcome concerns in this area. How and this would be something we could touch on a bit further. How much education do you think is needed to bring people around to this, especially considering, as James says, there have been bad past experiences with PFI?
Yeah, education is key, because if you don't know what solutions are out there, you get stuck. Ask others who've been successful. Ask, yeah. I think
yeah, I believe there's a new kind of fund for educating on heat pumps in particular. I can't remember the name of it. It's dropped my mind, but I think it's something that's being shared recently. Yeah, it's definitely something key, and investment is needed on that. I don't have a massive background in that area, but it's something that's needs investment in.
Okay. Question here from Jenny Foskett, who asks, do SFS install on roofs only, or can they use school land too?
We can. In fact, we've done a couple of carports, and we're looking at a couple of ground-mounted systems too.
Okay. Fantastic. So I think we've covered everything in the questions here. Is there anything else that either you or Robert or Laura would like to add that you feel like our audience would do well to know? Any parting thoughts?
It's always going to be a big jump to do it, but it's always going to be worth it. I think it's a massive, any efficiency measure in solar, it's showing that you're taking the right step forward. You're looking to benefit your local community, but also improve the health of the local community, and also meet your long-term vision. As Robert said, all these climate emergencies and targets are worthless if you're not actually doing something about it. So this is an easy way for you to do something about it.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I think some councils are amazing. They've done huge amounts of solar on their own buildings. They managed to find the funding for it and just got on and did it years ago. And other councils are still sort of, I don't know, talking, but just not getting on with it. They're finding excuses or finding reasons why they can't do it. And yes, I think it's very easy to find a reason why not to move forward. But we all, as a society, have to start thinking about how to get rid of those excuses. And I really do worry that we're still in there's 10 reasons why we can't do it. And with schools, the same thing. I mean, you only need one person who goes, not too sure. It doesn't happen. And, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, when our grandchildren ask us, well, why didn't you do more? What are we going to answer? Oh, well, I was a bit worried that, I hadn't double checked it with the sort of third lawyer in procurement as to whether the second comma was missing or not. Just get on with it.
Thank you, Robert. There's a very strong message to end on there. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. That's the time we have for today. Thanks for joining, and especially thank you, Robert and Laura, for your really insightful look at solar in this context. This webinar will be available to view shortly on the Elemental website. And if you're not already, please do follow us on LinkedIn. We are Elemental UK, and you can get all of our latest updates there. So once again, thank you, and everyone have a great afternoon.